Well, thank you, Pastor Michael, and thank you everyone else from Blue Point Bible Church for having me here. And my wife sends greetings. She wasn't able to join me this year. She greets especially those who she was able to meet last year. And as you know, we dodged a bullet with the snow, and she sent me a picture this morning in Newport, Kentucky, right by Cincinnati, Ohio, where we live is getting hammered with some snow right now. But it'll be short-lived. Spring is here. Well, I'm going to jump right into this. The topic that I'm speaking about today is one that appears all throughout the 66 books of the Bible. Actually, I'm kidding. There are only 10 verses devoted to this topic in Revelation 20, verses 1 through 10. And this topic is the 1,000 years, more popularly known as the Millennium. And although this topic has very limited exposure in Scripture, it has formed the basis of three major schools of thought: premillennialism, amillennialism, and postmillennialism. And not too long ago, I said that this was one of the hardest chapters in the Bible to understand. So it's really wild that I'm standing here attempting to teach about this topic today. Well, whether justified or not, all kinds of biblical passages have been cited as parallels to this brief text in Revelation 20. I'm sure you could think of others besides the ones I'm going to name, but these alleged parallel passages include Isaiah 11 and the wolf and the lamb dwelling together. Also descriptions of animal sacrifices in Ezekiel 43 and other passages as well. Now, some people believe that those 1,000 years are in our future. They have not yet begun. Some believe that they began about 2,000 years ago and continue to this day, not yet complete. Others believe the 1,000 years began in the first century and lasted for literally and exactly 1,000 years, ending in the Dark Ages. And some believe that they began and ended in the first century, lasting for about 40 years. This is probably the most popular position within full preterism. There's even a school of thought that says that the 1,000 years began during the days of Solomon, almost 1,000 years before Christ, lasting exactly 1,000 years and ending just before AD 70. Well, today I'm going to offer one more option for your for your consideration. I believe that the 1,000 years covered a period of about 60 years between roughly AD 70 and AD 132. That is, between the first great revolt, the first great Jewish revolt of AD 66 to 73, and the second great revolt led by Simon Bar Kokhba between the years AD 132 and 135. In this presentation, I will focus on 6 reasons why I believe this is the correct timing for this prophecy. And when we get to point number 5, that's when I'll share more details about what happened during the second great revolt led by Simon Bar Kokhba. So real briefly, and the handout that I gave you reflects this in a little bit more detail, but the 6 things that we will look at are these. Number 1, Revelation 19:17 through 20, verse 3, describes the capture of the beast, the false prophet, and Satan. 2 of these characters are cast into the lake of fire at that time, but Satan is not. The second thing is this, looking at the question of why Satan was sealed and bound and how he deceived the nations to war twice. The third thing is looking at the timing of Christ sitting on his throne with his saints, based on other scriptures that shed light on this. The fourth thing will be the identity of those who reigned with Christ, and the connection between Revelation 20, verse 4, where they're identified, and Revelation 13, which is very well connected to that identification. The fifth thing will be the persecution of the saints in the beloved city Jerusalem, as recorded in Revelation 20, verse 9. And the sixth point will be looking at how Satan later joined the beast and the false prophet, who were already in the lake of fire. So before examining these points more in depth, I would like to first read the text that we are looking at today, Revelation 20, verses 1 through 10. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit, and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal on him, so that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things, he must be released for a little while. And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was committed to them. Then I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus and for the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their foreheads or on their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him 1,000 years. Now when the 1,000 years have expired, Satan will be released from his prison, and will go out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. They went up on the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. And fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. The devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So, the first thing we're looking at is the capture of the beast and the false prophet and Satan. And to lead into this, I have a question, a rhetorical question. Do the events of Revelation 19 lead into the events of Revelation 20? In other words, does Revelation 19 provide a direct setting for what we read in the beginning of Revelation 20? Those who believe that the 1,000 years ended before AD 70 would probably say no to this question. But I believe the answer is yes, that Revelation 19 does lead into Revelation 20, provides a direct setting. And of course, we should always keep in mind that originally there were no chapter divisions in the Bible. But for just a moment, I want to back up a little bit and look at the last 3 verses of Revelation 19. In those verses, we see that the beast and the false prophet were captured and cast into the lake of fire, and their followers were killed and fed to the birds. Here's how these verses read. And I saw the beast, the kings of the earth and their armies, gathered together to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. Then the beast was captured, and with him the false prophet who worked signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These 2 were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone, and the rest were killed with the sword which proceeded from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. So, as I mentioned, I believe that the next 3 verses, Revelation 20, 1 through 3, flow chronologically from this. There we see that Satan was captured and sealed in a pit for 1,000 years. In other words, these 6 verses are all about the capture of the major players in the war against Christ and the saints. It was Satan who gave his power, throne, and authority to the beast, as we read in Revelation 13, verse 2. And the beast worked closely with the false prophet in that war, as we read in Revelation 13, verses 11 through 17. So I believe that Revelation 19, verse 17, through 20, verse 3, describes the capture of the beast, the false prophet, and Satan in AD 70 through 73. And that this was then followed by the 1,000 years. Now, you have a handout which is pretty brief, but later on I will provide full written notes. I know I'll be throwing out a lot of information and dates and so forth, and if it's a little difficult to follow orally, you'll have my full notes to read along with down the road if you'd like. Now, the second point I want to look at is why Satan was sealed according to the text. Revelation 20, verse 3, states that the purpose for sealing Satan in a pit for 1,000 years was so that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things he must be released for a little while. Well, this phrase, no more, deceiving no more, indicates that he had already been deceiving the nations for a while at that time. And in Revelation 12, verse 9, we see the same thing. That verse reads, "So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." And you'll notice that this verse, Revelation 12:9, speaks in the present tense. Satan deceives, like right now. Well, that was written, most of us would agree, around AD 65. So, if he was present tense deceiving the whole world at that time, I think this really creates difficulty for the view that the 1,000 years ended around AD 66. Meaning, according to that view, that Satan had been bound and restrained from deceiving that whole time, and then he was released to deceive the nations one last time. But instead, what we see is that Revelation 12 shows that before AD 66, he had been deceiving, not bound from deceiving, but had been deceiving the nations. And then he came down with great wrath, Revelation 12:9 also, and soon he gave his power, throne, and authority to the beast, Revelation 13:2, who made war, as we read in the next few verses. Well, in addition to this, a survey of the New Testament, I believe, also does not seem to show that Satan was bound in a bottomless pit from the time of the cross until roughly AD 66. Instead, we see in 1 Peter 5:8 that he was walking around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Believers who went astray could be delivered to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, 1 Corinthians 5:5. As the god of that age, he had blinded many minds, 2 Corinthians 4:4. We read that he frequently transformed himself into an angel of light, and his ministers were deceiving people by pretending also to be ministers of righteousness, 2 Corinthians 11:13 through 15. And in 1 Thessalonians 2:18, Paul said that multiple times Satan had hindered him from coming to the Thessalonians to visit them and minister to them. And also 1 Timothy 5:15 says that many had turned aside to follow after Satan. So it seems impossible to reconcile Satan being bound in a bottomless pit and at the same time freely walking around like a roaring lion seeking to devour people. Also in Romans 16:20, Paul wrote that the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet, or crush Satan under your feet shortly. It's believed that the book of Romans was written during the winter of AD 57 and 58. And so for that statement to be made at that time, this really sounds to me like a church that was presently fighting against the schemes of Satan. It doesn't sound like something Paul would say if Satan was at that time bound and sealed in a bottomless pit. Well, in Revelation 20:7-10, we see that after the 1,000 years, Satan would be released to once again deceive the nations, just as he did before the 1,000 years. This time, though, his time of deception would be brief. Revelation 20, verse 3 calls it a little while or a little season. And his purpose for deceiving them in these last three verses here, 7 through 10, his purpose for deceiving them was to gather them together to battle, according to verse 8. The question is, was this his purpose also for deceiving the nations the first time as well? And I think it was. I personally believe that when Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3, says that Satan would be bound so that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years were finished, that this was especially a reference to how Satan had deceived the nations in preparation for the first great revolt of AD 66 to 73. This deception was described all throughout the first 19 chapters of Revelation. We definitely see a push to war throughout those chapters. And the nations that he deceived to go to war during the first great revolt included Judea, Samaria, Galilee, Idumea, and Perea. But from what we see in Revelation 17:15, and I'm not going to quote it, but in Revelation 17:15 we see that Satan was also deceiving Jews throughout the diaspora who continued to take their marching orders from Jerusalem. And I think if you look at that text, you'll see the same thing. Well, in Revelation 21-3, John was told that Satan would be bound for a long time from being able to continue that deception, deceive the nations no more, until. And so I believe he was released just before the Second Great Revolt. Again, I'll talk more in detail about what happened during that revolt when we get to point 5. And of course, both revolts ended in great failure for the Jews. So in summary of this point, I believe that Satan deceived the nations to go to war at the time of both of the great Jewish revolts, and also that he gave his power, throne, and authority to the leaders of not just the first great revolt, but the second great revolt as well. The third point we'll look at is the timing of Christ sitting on his throne with his saints. And Revelation 20, verse 4, is not the first place in Scripture where we read about thrones being set in place for Jesus and his saints. Other examples include 2 passages in Daniel 7, 2 passages in Matthew, and a passage in Revelation. We'll look at all of those. But these passages show thrones being set up when the beast is defeated, when Jesus returns in judgment, and when the saints receive the kingdom. The first one, Daniel 7, verses 7 through 11, shows that thrones were set in place at the time when Daniel's fourth beast was slayed and burned. And I'm not going to read that passage, but just for reference, again, it's Daniel 7, verses 7 through 11. I think it's on your handout. And I think that most or all of us here would agree that the beast was defeated in AD 70. And it says in that text that at that time, thrones were put in place, and the court was seated, and the books were opened. That's Daniel 7, 9 through 10. And this same picture is again confirmed in Daniel 7, verses 23 through 27, where it's said that the fourth beast, the 10 horns, and a little horn would persecute the saints for 3.5 years, or a time, times, and half a time. That the little horn would change times in the law, and they would all be defeated. Well, in this text, it says that at this time, the saints would receive the kingdom, verse 27, and that a court would be seated, verse 26 of Daniel 7. Likewise, in Matthew 19, 27 to 28, this is what we read. I'll quote this one. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, "See, we have left all and followed you. Therefore, what shall we have?" So Jesus said to them, "Assuredly I say to you that in the regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." And similarly in Matthew 25:31, this is what we read, "When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory." And the last example, Revelation 3:21, Jesus says this to the church at Laodicea, "To him who overcomes, I will grant to sit with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne." And again, this letter was delivered to the saints likely around AD 65. So when he said that, it was still future to them, about sitting on the throne with Christ after overcoming. So the point in bringing up these 5 passages is this: how could the 1,000 years end before AD 70 if that was to be the time when Jesus came with his angels and sat on the throne of his glory with his saints? But on the other hand, these passages show the coming of Christ and the resurrection taking place first, and then the saints inheriting the kingdom and sitting with Christ on thrones with judgment committed to them after that takes place. So sitting on thrones was something that Revelation 20 verse 4 says would mark the beginning of the 1,000 years. And this, I would suggest, fits an AD 70 timeline, but not an AD 30 timeline. Okay, the fourth point I want to look at is identifying those who reigned with Christ. And we see this in Revelation 20 verse 4. And when you look at that text, there's a bit of a difficulty at first because it opens up simply by saying, they sat on them, without first saying, who is they? If you look at the text, I think you'll see the same thing. I looked at different translations. It just, without referencing anybody, it just says, they sat on them. Well, after this initial statement, what we do see, though, is that special or even exclusive attention is given to those who, quote, had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus and for the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their foreheads or on their hands. And this description is clearly taken directly from Revelation 13:11 through 17, where the second beast is shown to be working closely with the first beast to make war on the saints for 42 months. And I, again, think that most of us would agree that that 42 months took place during the Jewish-Roman War between AD 66 and 70. So this is probably the biggest reason why I respectfully disagree with a number of other preterists, who I love dearly, who teach that the 1,000 years began around AD 30 at the time of the cross. I feel that they would need to demonstrate that the 42-month reign of the beast took place prior to the cross, or to AD 30. And I'm not aware of anybody holding that position. So I believe that Revelation 20 verse 4 clearly shows the 1,000 years beginning after the beast's 42-month reign, since those who participated in the 1,000 years with Christ were those who refused to worship the beast and take his mark. And just a little note, this verse tells us that the way that those saints were martyred was by being beheaded. And if you heard my presentation last year, you know that I believe that the beast was Israel rather than Rome, and Israel especially under the leadership of the Zealot movement. And along those lines, Josephus wrote quite a bit about how the Zealots would cut the throats of those who wouldn't follow their war agenda. And since they used swords and not pocket knives, this very well could have meant that they beheaded their enemies, even if Josephus didn't use the word beheaded. Well, a few months ago I saw a quote from a preterist guy named Doug Wilkinson, and I thought that he gave a good explanation for why Revelation 24 shows that the 1,000 years could not have begun before AD 70. First, Doug referenced what he called the common full preterist paradigm, where the millennium is in the first century between the cross and the destruction of the temple. And then this is what Doug added. He said, in this position, the millennium ends before the mark of the beast is even issued. And since the martyrs of Revelation 20 verse 4 were killed for not taking the mark, that would mean that those martyrs are not killed until after the millennium. So in other words, they're made alive to reign in the millennium, but according to that scenario, they wouldn't have even been killed until after the millennium. And he goes on and says, that means the only people who are explicitly said to be in the millennium are actually excluded from it. I thought that was a good quote. And in summary on this point, those who reigned with Christ for 1,000 years were beheaded during the Jewish-Roman War of AD 66 to 73, having overcome the beast by refusing to worship him and take his mark. They were rewarded by reigning with Christ. I don't believe this fits the idea of the 1,000 years beginning in AD 30, but I think it does very well fit the idea of the 1,000 years beginning around AD 70. And the fifth point I want to look at has everything to do with Revelation 20 verse 9 and what seems to be a picture of saints being persecuted in Jerusalem. That verse reads again that let me find Let me find it and read it again explicitly. They went up on the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. And if we look elsewhere in the New Testament, the beloved city was a frequent reference to Jerusalem. So the Jerusalem and saints or Christians in Jerusalem were to be surrounded. And I think that this language, again, suggests a targeted persecution against Christians who were living in Jerusalem. And indeed, if we look at the history of what happened during the Second Great Revolt led by Simon Bar Kokhba, that's exactly what happened. And before I read an actual quote about that, though, I want to set some background, since I keep on referencing the Second Great Revolt, and I think people generally know more about the First Great Revolt than they do about the Second Great Revolt. So let me go into some background and details on what happened. And to set that up, after the First Great Revolt ended in AD 73, church history and secular history records that there was a period of relative peace in that region for about the next 60 years, except for one minor revolt that took place around AD 117. But although the city of Jerusalem lay in ruins, this period was actually marked by a Christian presence in the area. And there's a book written in 2009 by Jeffrey Butts titled The Secret Legacy of Jesus. And in that book, and he documents this well, he writes that there were a number of Christians who had fled to Pella before the war, and church historians talk about that as well. They fled to Pella in Jordan, and he writes that they returned after that war, after AD 73, to Jerusalem, and they came to the place where the upper room had been. The upper room, of course, being where the believers gathered on the day of Pentecost, waiting to be imbued with power. And these believers came back from Pella and went to that location and rebuilt a Christian meeting place. It became a church in Jerusalem. And from that time, AD 73, until 60 years later, in AD 132, when the Second Great Revolt began, there were actually 14 bishops of the church in Jerusalem. And what's pretty fascinating is that the first one is said to be the first cousin of Jesus, named Simeon. And he was the bishop of Jerusalem from the time that James was martyred. We read about his martyrdom in Acts 12 at the hands of Herod. And the person who replaced James as bishop was Simeon, said to be the cousin of Jesus. And he's cited a couple of times in the New Testament. Actually, in most translations it says the brother of Jesus, but there's a lot of proof that that those four people named were actually cousins rather than brothers. And Simeon was one of them. And he was the bishop until AD 107, so for a good 40 years. And according to Hegesippus, a church historian, it was Simeon who led the Christians to Pella in the first place, and it was Simeon who brought many of them back. Not all of them came back, but he led many of them back to Jerusalem, where they established this church and this Christian presence. And then he continued as the bishop. So there's also a quote by a Jewish historian, Gedalia Alon, writing about how in AD 130, the Roman Emperor Hadrian took notice of this same church in Jerusalem when he visited at that time. And here's the quote. And I want us to notice a couple things from this quote. Another early Christian chronicler, Alexander the Monk, writing probably around the middle of the 9th century, says, "When Hadrian went to the holy city and saw it in ruins, except for one small Christian church, he gave orders that the whole city be rebuilt, except for the temple. When the Jews heard of this, they streamed there from every direction, and before long, the whole city of Jerusalem was rebuilt. And this is a quote to notice, but once again, an evil spirit entered into them and agitated them, and they rebelled again against Rome. They set over themselves a commander called Bar Kokhba," and he's the person I want to talk about now. And in my written notes, you'll see sources for any quotes that I mention here today. But Notice that he mentioned an evil spirit entering the Jews once again around AD 130 as they crowded into the city to rebuild the temple. And it was only 2 years later that the Second Great Revolt began. And the leader of that revolt was Simon Bar Kokhba, who, just like the leaders of the First Great Revolt, was also a zealot. And he also, as a couple of those earlier zealot leaders did, he claimed to be the Messiah. And here's a quote from a British scholar of rabbinical literature who wrote, "A century after the death of Jesus, another man appeared, Simon Bar Kokhba, who openly claimed to be the Messiah. He was a zealot, and most of the Pharisaic leaders did not admit his claim. But the greatest of those rabbis, those leaders at the time, was Rabbi Akiba, and he publicly hailed Simon as the Messiah." And the Jewish history site Livius adds this: "According to the Christian church historian Eusebius, Simon claimed to be a luminary who had come down to the Jews from heaven. On some of his coins during the revolt, and in his letters, he calls himself Prince, a word that had very strong messianic connotations. He was usually called Bar Kokhba, which meant son of the star, which again is a messianic claim. There were miracles attributed to him, including that he had been seen spewing out flames from his mouth." Other coins were struck with the legend Eleazar the priest during that time, again AD 132 to 135, which strongly suggests that they resurrected a new priest. They elected a new priest just for that time. And Simon was so successful in his revolt that the Emperor Hadrian was obliged to dispatch his best generals to suppress the rebellion. Julius Severus, the governor of Britain, was one of them. 3 legions were deployed. No less than 17 auxiliary units are known to have fought in Palestine. They had to send more reinforcements. They had to even draft Italian boys, apparently underage boys, because they needed more manpower to put down this revolt. And this quote goes on to say that very few Jews survived in the end. 50 of their most important outposts and 985 better-known villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 Jews were killed in the various engagements or battles. As for the numbers who perished from starvation, disease, or fire, that was impossible to establish. So possibly even greater numbers died in that Second Great Revolt than even died in the First Great Revolt that we know more about. And it goes on to say that the Romans resorted to terrible atrocities to win the war. Bodies were left unburied for several years. There are 3 reports that children were wrapped in Torah scrolls and burned alive. And when the Romans brought Simon's head back to the Emperor Hadrian, this emperor said, "If Simon's God had not slain him, who could have overcome him?" So this was a really tough revolt for Rome to put down. It sounds like from history that it was even tougher than the first one. Now, some of the coins during that time were also included the words "to the freedom of Jerusalem," which is the same thing that was written on the coins in the first revolt. And so it was a repeat. And Simon eventually mustered an army of almost 350,000. And in the ancient world, that was an enormous army. It was actually greater in number than the entire Roman army at the time. And of course, Rome was the empire. And history records that even non-Jews joined Simon Bar Kokhba in his effort, also hoping to overthrow the Roman Empire. And this fact may speak to what we see in Revelation 20, verse 8, where it says that the number of those who came to battle was as the sand of the sea. And I think that could fit, since they had an army that was even larger than Rome's army. And coming back to the persecution here in just a minute, according to jewishhistory.org website, Simon had the support of many Jewish rabbis, which was unlike the First Great Revolt. But as we already saw, the most influential rabbi was Akiva ben Joseph. And here's a revealing quote. It was Rabbi Akiva who ascribed to Simon Bar Kokhba the famous messianic verse, A star will shoot forth from Jacob. Numbers 24:17. And that is how he got the name Kokba, which means star. In essence, Rabbi Akiva crowned him the Messiah. Rabbi Akiva was so widely respected among the people that if he saw in Simon messianic qualities, then the people immediately elevated him to the level of the Messiah. And this helps us understand very well why the Christians would take no part in the war. It would have made one Messiah too many. So here's where we come back to the persecution that took place during that time, and which I believe could very well have been a fulfillment of Revelation 20, verse 9. Justin Martyr was an early church leader who lived from AD 100 to 165, and he gave the following account about the targeting of Christians in Jerusalem during that Second Great Revolt. Here's what he said. During the recent Jewish war, Bar Kokhba, the leader of the revolt of the Jews, had the order issued against Christians that, if they did not deny and defame Jesus Christ, they would be led away to suffer the most severe punishments. There was actually apparently a new Sanhedrin court during the revolt. In other words, the Sanhedrin that we read about in the New Testament was resurrected again just during this 3.5-year or almost 4-year period. And this Sanhedrin had the authority to execute Christians who refused to blaspheme Christ or acknowledge Simon as king or join his rebellion against Rome. There's a book titled Rabbi Akiva's Messiah. I don't have it, I haven't read it, but I've seen some excerpts. In this book tells the stories of 5 Christian men during that revolt who went on trial before this resurrected Sanhedrin, and they were executed for holding firm to their faith in Christ. So whatever that fire was that came down from heaven, that came down from God in Revelation 29, it seems clear that it was to devour those who surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city, so that it would prevent the Jerusalem church from being entirely devoured, because they were literally surrounded. Simon Bar Kokhba had control of the entire countryside, and here's Jerusalem in the middle of Judea, and this is where this thriving Christian church is, and they set out to destroy them from all sides. So it seems that this, whatever the fire from heaven was, that it was accomplished when the Romans prevailed over Simon's great army that was targeting this Christian church. So the last point I want to look at is number 6. Satan joining the beast and the false prophet in the lake of fire. And in Revelation 20, verse 10, again we read that it says, "And the devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are." And in every translation I looked at, we see this present tense, are, not were, but are. And the language used in this verse, I think, suggests that when Satan was cast into the lake of fire, that the beast and the false prophet were already there. And again, as we noted, the beast and the false prophet were key characters in the Jewish-Roman War of the First Great Revolt, and they were cast into the lake of fire during that war, as we read in Revelation 19:20. And as we already noticed, I think, at the end of Revelation 19, it does not record Satan being cast into the lake of fire at that same time along with them. Instead, at that time, he was cast into the bottomless pit for 1,000 years. And then he led a second disastrous war, and only after that did he join the beast who he previously empowered, according to Revelation 12:9 and 13:2. So the progression of this story from Revelation 19:17 through Revelation 20, verse 10, and the language that's used here in this verse, Revelation 20:10, I think it fits well if the beast and the false prophet were destroyed in the first great revolt of AD 66 to 73, and Satan was sealed in the bottomless pit at that time, and then 65 years later, Satan was cast into the lake of fire after his final brief reign of deception during the Second Great Revolt. And one final thought, I won't develop this, but there's a brief passage in Revelation 10, verses 1 through 4, which I think has puzzled a number of us. And in those verses, we see that John heard 7 thunders utter their voices, but when he was just about to write down what they wrote, a voice told him, "Seal up the things which the 7 thunders uttered, and do not write them." And this is very uncharacteristic of the rest of Revelation. That's what we read in Daniel when the events that were going to take place were hundreds of years down the road. But elsewhere in Revelation, he was told to don't seal anything. The time is at hand. But here, he's told, seal up these things which the 7 thunders uttered and do not write them. So here's just a thought-provoking question. Did John hear details about the second great revolt, but because that time was about 65 years away, those details were sealed? I don't know. I'm not sure, but it's just a thought. So thank you, and I look forward to your feedback to what I've presented today.